No, I'm sorry.
Any questions for Professor Flatto?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, it seems to me that, at least in the case of the rabbinic text that you analyzed, there's a certain, it often is an act that is a crime. So first, the example of circumcision that you spoke about in the last 2 minutes. It seems like there's a certain state of mind or mental attitude that is attached to specific sins.
Yes.
That goes beyond just intention to commit a certain crime. In other words, there's a certain mental attitude. This is something that what's his name? Fletcher's rethinking criminal law, right? When he talks about recidivism. So he takes issue with the idea that he rejects, of course, that a recidivist could be punished, could be penalized beyond what the law says, what the law prescribes for this crime. And how is that possible? Because there's a certain mental attitude of affronting the legal system in and of itself by committing this crime against people. And I think something similar is going on here.
Yeah.
What the rabbis seem to be saying is that beyond, epikoras and minutim and all the different terms, idolatry and even circumcision are acts that go beyond just the intention to violate a law.
What I would say, thank you, Shai. I think it's interesting, and I agree. I would just say, to me, that's within the spectrum of the move towards religiosity. That's the way I would think about it. You really, if I had time, I could chart a sort of a speculative hierarchy, violating one law, violating cardinal laws, violating all laws, violating laws with a certain attitude, violating laws in a public space, violating certain very covenantal laws, and then starting to, I think at the highest level, rejecting covenant or being a sinner, an individual that somehow is tainted and sinful, even separate from its legal trappings. And I would just put that within, we could argue maybe what the hierarchy is, but I put it as part of that sort of momentum that I'm actually trying to trace. So I'm with you, yeah.
It might be helpful, I think, to replace the word religious with theological, and that puts avodah zarah in a whole new light, where it's not just about a rejection of a system, but it's about rejecting the good norm of the system, which is belief in God, and belief in God in a very specific way.
Yeah.
And similarly with circumcision, which is a rejection of the very theological basis of the covenant. And I think it might be helpful also to think about the way that you're analyzing the rabbinic interpretation of the verse. They're essentially taking what could otherwise be seen as legal language, karet, rasha, and taking those out of a legal lexicon and putting them into a theological lexicon, where karet is a divinely ordained punishment. It has nothing to do with the courts and is completely amorphous as far as we're concerned.
Right. No, that's helpful. Yes. That's fine.
It seems to me there's also a kind of social aspect to this comparison. I mean, for the Qumran community or communities, could take, karet, cutting off, expelling from the community quite literally, because they have a community which takes quite a bit to get admitted into, and therefore a failure of admissions reflects on the whole community. Whereas in the rabbinic context, at least in this period, it's not clear what authority they would have or what tools they would have to exclude somebody.
Right, I agree, and I think the Rasha stuff actually plays into that in interesting ways, because I think rabbis start using that as certain communal markers in some ways, in a way that actually starts. Yeah, I agree, and I think that's sort of. I actually struggle a little bit in just trying to conceptualize this. Where to put like law and religion and the covenantal community within. Obviously, they're related, but that is a factor here also. And then you're just saying in a very practical sense also, but I'm also saying in a conception sense. I think that's true too. The more there's this sort of it's interesting to me that the rabbis use the language of brit, which doesn't appear in the verse, even in the rabbinic midrash. But still, that's right that the rabbinic community is much more loose than.
And therefore, denying entrance to the world to come becomes
the way it is.
In some ways, an easy ticket out.
Right. Yes.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I want to suggest to bridge the gap between Mishnah and Sanhedrin, because I think it's also very important that the fact that for the Qumran community, belonging to the community is also equal to taking part in the time and in the world to come in their eyes. So expelling from the community is, in a sense, just an active expulsion from taking part in whatever they saw as their vision for the end of time and the world to come.
Right, no, that's definitely a on-point comment, which I'll think about more. Another complicating factor in the Qumran community is it's dualism, and how much every sin is reflecting also on a sinner, which, Aharon certainly reads this text this way, which I agree in part, but think that also needs meditating, because the reflection of what being a son of darkness is a violator of law. So I do think they're bound up in one another, but the link of world becomes also interesting.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask, is this spectrum that you're drawing from crime to sin to sinner actually putting religion and law into edges of into contradictory, as two extreme oppositions to one another? Meaning, you suggest that the legalist view would be very different from the religious one. And once Chazal are putting those averot, placing them in the world to come, they're actually going to a religious edge and avoiding their legal dimensions. First of all, to understand if I understood you correctly, if this is what you're suggesting.
I think that's a basic.
So, aren't you assuming something about religion and law, some certain relationship between religion and law that I just want to make you commit to it? You are saying that religion and law are two different things in the way that they push in different directions, and you're maybe suggesting that Chazal take the biblical invention of crime as a sin to a more religious
sphere.
Yeah, and if this is what you're suggesting, I want to challenge your suggestion, because the framing of Megale Panim Torah and all those other guys as people who don't go to the world to come, if you look at it in comparison to the big project of Halacha, they actually made biblical law into much more of a law than it was.
Sure.
And certainly more than maybe also the Qumran did. So how does this...
I agree. I think that's to me what's fascinating about this text and what the rabbis are doing with it. Because of course I would, not knowing this text, if we never had this text, I would think the rabbis are a world of such, thick legalism. And of course they are. What's interesting to me is, despite that, I think at a moment of where it's really it's hitting, it's all, coming to the fore, they move in a direction that is carving out a sphere of, and I agree the terminology gets a little tricky here, but somehow a religious sphere that isn't just defined by its legalism. And that to me is what's interesting given that larger context. So I don't think I disagree, but I would say, that's what's novel here.
I'd just like to push back and ask you, you're framing it as kind of they're creating a religious sphere despite their legalism.
Yeah.
But to me, it actually seems more like they're creating that religious sphere because of their legalism. Because basically, if you compare Qumran or biblical law to rabbinic law, then in rabbinic law, it's basically an impossibility to observe all of the laws of the Torah, right? I think they're very much aware of that as they create more and more law, by necessity, you're going to have to violate something at some time.
Right.
And it's impossible to live with that Qumran idea that you'll be expelled from the community.
It's interesting.
And therefore they say, okay, if you're doing this intentionally, okay, but it'll only be in the world to come. But
I would just make one comment. Whatever, that's really interesting, and thank you, that's helpful. I would say whatever motivates, whether it's a communal structure, whether it's historical, I would still say we have to look at what has been produced. What's been produced is a sphere of religiosity that has an independence from pure legalism. So even if they're back into that, certain, they have, you know, Qumran holds people to superhuman standards that they won't because they have ideas of penitence and are aware of error and all sorts of things. Through that, they are creating a sphere that I think is worth knowing.
We have time for last question. Please.
I wanted to flip a little bit some of the questions, or one idea that some of the questions have been touching on, and because you're talking about like there's this base, and you know we're all nodding. There's this base of legalism in the rabbis, and then there's this gesture or turn. I think you said towards religiosity or towards theology, maybe. But what about if you also unsettle the first category? You know, because I think because it's kind of the same problem. We are all we're coming to some acceptance who start speaking that this is a legal system, but maybe we're ignoring that problem, right? The problem is just as much in the other direction. If you want to describe what this thing is, and perhaps letting go of that, you know, label for a moment also will.
So get the
somehow
move. I would
change.
have to. I think I have to talk to you more about like how that would play out. But it's interesting. I think you're right.
Because
We'll take the legalist.
Because these are our. I mean, they're you know.
They are
their words are not the
constructs,
same.
but-
They're not right. But are those really the how it's anachronistic? But how anachronistic is it? Are we doing damage to? Is there a way that we, even though we're here and now, can somehow formulate it so that we don't get stuck? Because you're standing on the law and you're pointing to theology, but
Interesting.
it's the same.
Sorry. So we have to leave the stage
Yes.
to
Sorry.
next speaker. Edith Courage. I hope you're okay. Yeah.